what entrepreneurship industry actors mainly do is to increase confidence. Maybe the way to say it is that it's building up confidence more than it's building up competence. Success in entrepreneurship is just incredibly unlikely. Yeah. It is rare, right? That is one thing that we know for like a real fact in social science. It's really rare. Maybe we should start thinking about entrepreneurship as something we engage in through critical experiments where we try to disprove our idea, right? Instead of saying, let me take this idea and see if I can make it work. You should do experiments that sort of prove out that the idea does not work. And if it turns out the idea does not work, you should get out of it.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Coffeezilla. Today we are talking to someone I've been kind of a fan of his work for a long time, but finally I get to sit down and talk with him. This is Dr. Jarmin of the Copenhagen Business School. He is an associate professor, and he wrote a paper about the, I'm going to totally mess this up, the Veblennian entrepreneur, AKA, I just want to say, because I want to call it this during this show, the wantrepreneur sort of thing. And it's towards an unentrepreneurial economy, the entrepreneurship industry, and the rise of the Veblennian entrepreneur. Can you summarize that idea for us real quick? Because I think it's a really interesting concept.
Yeah, so thank you for the introduction, Stephen, by the way.
Absolutely, thanks for
and thank you for the opportunity. So the Veblennian entrepreneur is or let's call it the wantrepreneur, that's fine too, is our effort to sort of put a label on what I think a lot of people are seeing, right? The fact that there are people starting entrepreneurship, not so much with the intention of actually becoming innovation-driven entrepreneurs, but more actually to just sort of engage in the entrepreneurial lifestyle and to build up the kind of identity that comes with that. So basically, it's entrepreneurship pursued for identity purposes, not productive purposes.
You guys have all seen this at whether it's your university, you've seen it at some coffee shops. It's a lot of times people are pursuing entrepreneurship just to sort of tell you that they're an entrepreneur kind of idea, like the whole thing of like, I'm a CEO. Well, when did your company start? Well, yesterday. And you're like, oh, okay, that's very interesting. And part of your paper argues, you're trying to, if I understand it right, you're trying to explain a set of sort of problems or ideas in the field, one of which is that, okay, we see that entrepreneurship leads to all sorts of good things in the economy, but largely this is driven by a few companies. And yes. Then you also see that, oh, well, actually there's the sort of the failing entrepreneurs or people who kind of have undersized results. And there's people like Amazon, Apple, all these companies that are driving the majority of the US economy. You're saying that it's actually becoming more prevalent and you're getting more and more sort of failing entrepreneurs entering the ecosystem as proportional to their like successful counterparts. And you're wondering why, and you're sort of saying there's this industry around wantrepreneurs. Is that basically the idea?
Yes, and that's causing a particular kind of entrepreneurial firm to pop up. And the kind of firm that is causing to pop up is what we call Veblennian entrepreneurs or wantrepreneurs. So basically, it's not our observation that the quality of entrepreneurship is falling. That's from other work, which is referenced in the paper, but basically finding that like people tend to think that the US is incredibly entrepreneurial, and that's actually not the case by international standards. Entrepreneurship is also becoming more rare in the US. There are fewer and fewer entrepreneurial companies in the sense that there are fewer startups. And the quality of those startups is declining, right?
All bad things.
All bad things. As you say, it's true that there are like entrepreneurial companies play a potentially very big role in the economy, right? There's things that entrepreneurial companies do that established companies don't do. So economic dynamism is very much dependent on having well-functioning entrepreneurship, right? But that seems to be becoming more rare. And there are all sorts of explanations that you could have for that. You might say that, for instance, incumbent market power is increasing, right? So Google, Facebook, and Amazon are basically buying up and closing down all the really potentially promising entrepreneurial companies before they become big, right? That's one vision of it. The other is that there's just fewer good ideas to go around, right? That the good ideas are getting harder to find. And you could also say that entrepreneurship education maybe is getting worse, right? So entrepreneurs are more poorly prepared for entrepreneurship. You might say something about venture capital not working very well. All of those arguments are valid. And, social science is such that usually things are really complex and things interact. The thing that we're saying with that paper is that our understanding of the decline in entrepreneurial quality has not taken into account that there has been this really rapidly growing and by now quite large entrepreneurship industry, which are companies that target entrepreneurs as their consumers, right? And purportedly help entrepreneurs to identify and develop ideas into profitable businesses.
Let's maybe expand on the types of sort of entrepreneur help that one might see in this industry, right?
Yes. So there are different things, right? You mentioned that people will have seen this at their universities, right? Many universities now have sort of these entrepreneurship hubs, right? That could be classed as a kind of entrepreneurship industry. This is something which is marketing to entrepreneurs to try to help them. There's a lot of academic writing on this. Books by academics, books by practitioners, like experienced entrepreneurs who then give advice. There's a lot of sort of, you would call it back office support for entrepreneurs, right? We'll do your accounting, we'll do your legal, we'll do your admin. There are lots of entrepreneurship conferences, expos. There's lots of online media.
Like Shark Tank, stuff like that. Like
Shark Tank on television. And then there's also like the Dutch type of business magazine, right? Wired, Fast Company, things like that. And basically a heap of books that you can get off of Amazon or anywhere else that will tell you about how to become a successful entrepreneur.
Sure.
Right? So there's a whole sort of suite of this that all sort of pretends to help entrepreneurs, right? Plus, of course, there are college courses, incubators, accelerators, things associated with venture capital as well. All sorts of things that are sort of trying to do this, promoting entrepreneurs, helping them identify opportunities, and turning opportunities into valuable businesses, right?
And this is why I wanted to talk to you, because I read this paper and I said, oh my gosh, this intersects with a lot of what I talk about. I mean, obviously, sometimes I'm talking about outright scams, but a lot of times I'm talking about people who are sort of proposing that, oh, if you're wanting to go into Facebook ads or, making a little Amazon store or, starting an idea, come to us. We're going to help you if you just pay some nominal fee. And they make their living by basically taking these fees. So they're basically piggybacking on the entrepreneurship industry and saying, like, we are helping you guys become better, which is a fascinating take. And there could be a role for that if they are indeed making entrepreneurs better. But it seems like there's we actually see entrepreneurship quality, as you say, declining. And so,
go
ahead.
Yeah. So I think it's like in a gold rush, right? It's always good to sell shovels, and you need somebody to sell shovels.
Yeah,
right?
You do.
For sure. Otherwise, there will be no digging. The thing about the entrepreneurship industry, I mean, we don't know a whole lot about this from research, but what we do know suggests that what entrepreneurship industry actors mainly do is to increase confidence. They increase people's confidence in their ability to become entrepreneurs. So they enter, right? We can see that if you consume more goods from the entrepreneurship industry, you tend to become an entrepreneur at higher rates.
Right.
But the performance of those ventures that consume the most goods from the entrepreneurship industry tends to be lower.
Wow. That is really interesting. So you're getting people who sort of, you're encouraging people to join, and that's successful. They're successful at that, but it's maybe not so successful, or it's demonstrably not as successful at getting them to succeed. And in fact, maybe it's encouraging people to go into the entrepreneurship industry who maybe should not be going into it.
Who at least, or maybe the way to say it is that it's building up confidence more than it's building up competence.
That's a
I think
great way to say
that
it.
might be a way to say it.
Right. Yeah. And one thing you talk about is like also entrepreneurs, part of this new thing is it's not entrepreneurship necessarily as, you know, a job as much as it is an identity. And the
I
way
think
you get that identity is by buying stuff instead of doing. Like it used to, maybe you would think that you'd become an entrepreneurship by doing, but actually there's some people are trying to become entrepreneurs almost by buying.
I think that's the right. So there are a couple of things going on. I think the fact that we have this celebration of entrepreneurs, right? I mean, I think that's uncontroversial. That entrepreneurship is one of the most celebrated things you can probably do, right?
Yeah.
And entrepreneurs are some of the most celebrated actors in the economy.
Mm-hmm.
That makes it possible to benefit from entrepreneurship simply by being an entrepreneur. Like having a company sort of gets you into good company, so to speak.
Yeah.
So that it's infinitely better to tell your parents that you are working on your startup than it is to work as a barista, which might actually pay you more because the entrepreneurship thing could actually pay you nothing, right? So that's one thing. The other thing is that because there is an entrepreneurship industry that provides goods and services, it becomes possible to consume those goods and services to do things that are similar to what you might call real entrepreneurs, right? I say that in scare quotes, right?
Yeah.
You can consume your way into an entrepreneurial identity because we have somehow separated the being an entrepreneur from the success of the endeavor, right?
Right.
And that makes a lot of sense, actually. Like that's not unreasonable because success in entrepreneurship is just incredibly unlikely. Yeah. It is rare, right? That is one thing that we know for like a real fact in social science. It's really rare. And so to say that you can only be an entrepreneur if you're successful would make no sense because then there'd be a huge category of people who would basically like lack a category. So that makes some sense, but that at the same time becomes an excuse for something which is more insidious. And that is that you can basically be in this consumption practice and that can make you an entrepreneur.
And that is useless to the economy. I mean, there's nothing useful going on there other than you're just spending money on things that aren't necessarily making you do anything, right? Because you're just it's just a consumption at that point of just
the short answer is that it's totally unproductive, right? I mean, the term Veblendian entrepreneurship, some people might have had econ classes where they've heard about Veblen goods, which is basically the technical jargon for luxury goods. Things that get more desirable, the more expensive they get. So oysters, champagne, cars, racehorses, stuff like that, right?
Yeah.
So there's a way in which, because people don't use it right? Nobody really likes oysters, right? But people like the social signaling that eating expensive oysters can give them. So the fact that this thing is expensive is part of the value, right? The functional value is unimportant. And that's some of the idea here. It's the social signaling that is valuable to people. It's not the value that the company produces.
And that's so interesting because a lot of what I see, there are valuations for certain courses, masterminds, these coaching calls that their cost seems to have nothing to do with any kind of objective metric. It's like, oh, how much is your mastermind? I'd believe them just as much if they said 2,500 as 2,500,000. Sorry, not 2,500, 250,000. Because of the fact, and I've heard both, by the way, from different people. I was on a Clubhouse room last night where this hypnotist was telling us that he charges $300,000 for coaching. And it's just ridiculous. You're just thinking, well, who would buy this? But what you're saying is that there's a whole type of person who like, they sort of see, oh, the more it costs, the more I can signal that I'm the type of person who can afford these kind of things. Therefore, I must sort of be a big deal in a way that you'd buy a super expensive Rolex, even if you don't really like watches, because it's more about signaling that you sort of have the thing, right?
Yes. Yeah, that's where the value comes from, right? And what we're saying is that there are people who become entrepreneurs who might have a sense that they are not going to be, who have a sense that they might not be particularly likely to create enormous value, but who will still benefit from being just in the category. I mean, most people know that one does not just start a biotech company, right? But one can be an entrepreneur. You just need basically a pitch deck.
And you
Often.
can kind of say that you're starting a biotech company, right? We saw that with Theranos.
Yes.
We saw somebody just start a biotech company, and we saw, the hype bubble form around it, where people just go, oh, well, this must be the next big thing because they're excited. Meanwhile, all the scientists are saying there's no way. There's just no way. And everybody else in Silicon Valley is like, Elizabeth Holmes, you're doing such a good job. Blah, blah, blah. And we're sort of parroting the idea, but it is true that there is sort of an encouragement at all costs, positivity at all costs of this kind of field. And like you said, rightfully so, sometimes because there's so much failure that's faced, that sort of is maybe the initial impetus. But at the end of your paper, you say there might be a good reason to discourage people out of entrepreneurship. What did you mean by that?
Okay, so some of the uncertainty that surrounds entrepreneurship, you can't get around, right? It was not obvious that there was a business to be built on renting out spare rooms in your house, right? And yet Airbnb became a thing, right? There was uncertainty that you couldn't sort of reduce without trying. So what I would suggest is that right, a lot of the hoo-ha celebration of entrepreneurship that you also mentioned sort of says, just go and try it, right? So I think especially as entrepreneurship educators, we should maybe say, you really need to know that there's a downside to this. You really need to know that success is very unlikely. So in that alone should sort of make you say, maybe you shouldn't do it. Once though, but still people will have ideas that it's hard to gauge whether they are valuable or not, and it's hard to gauge whether people will be capable or incapable of executing them, right? There are situations where you won't know. And so I think the approach there is to say, okay, maybe it's worth trying, but then set up, and this is not my idea, this is from a team out of Bocconi University in Milan. We're saying, maybe we should start thinking about entrepreneurship as something we engage in through critical experiments, where we try to disprove our idea. Right? Instead of saying, let me take this idea and see if I can make it work, right? You should do experiments that sort of prove out that the idea does not work. And if it turns out the idea does not work, you should get out of it. So sort of flipping the burden of evidence around, instead of saying, let me prove that this is great, right? Assume that the idea is not good. Work as hard as you can to make it good, and then do an experiment to test out whether you should just abandon it.
And here's why that's really important, because one of the things that is the real challenge of entrepreneurship is that part of what's lionized is going through the valley of death of like, this idea is not working, right? The problem with that is you have no idea of whether that valley of death has any kind of meaningful end for your company. So you have people who are sort of persisting in their failure and going, oh, this is what an entrepreneur goes through, when maybe they should persist. But more than likely, in a lot of these cases, they should exit once they've like kind of gotten their minimal viable product. They realize there's no audience for this, no consumers, get out. So I do appreciate you really saying that. And because we want to give people who are hungry for, they're thinking about becoming an entrepreneur or whatever, the best tools for doing that in a way that's meaningful. What I always tell people is you should know the statistics. It shouldn't discourage you from doing it, but you need to know what the real odds are. Now, let's talk about the cost of entrepreneurship real quick.
Yeah, because I think this is actually underappreciated.
I totally
agree. The fact that there are so many costs to entrepreneurship. So just sort of the baseline one, right? I hear a lot of students saying, it'll be great for my CV to be an entrepreneur. And actually the evidence is quite the opposite. It's actually not easier to get a job when you have entrepreneurial experience. It's the opposite. It's harder, right? And there are lots of reasons for that have to do with organizations often wanting people to be specialized.
Right.
And I would say also, if I was an organization, I probably wouldn't want somebody who was a specialist in failing and very comfortable with failing. I would want people who didn't take huge risk, right? That's one part. The other part is that people who become entrepreneurs actually have lower lifetime earnings than people who have like steady wage employment.
You are blowing my audience's mind right now, by the way.
Yeah. Okay. So this is an underappreciated fact. And the same actually goes for working in a startup. Working in a startup does not lead to higher lifetime earnings. And Stephen, I mean, we can put the links to the data for this in the show notes.
Please, let's do that.
Because that's actually a real thing, right? Your earnings are generally lower, whether you are an entrepreneur or whether you just work in a startup.
Because because by the way, I want to be clear, the big idea is in a lot of these cases is, hey, the 9-to-5 is holding you down. You need to escape the rat race by becoming an entrepreneur. You need to escape that, live the lifestyle you are meant for with yachts, champagne, and Lamborghinis by going to become an entrepreneurship. And you know what's going to help you? Whether it be a course or whatever form of entrepreneur help, the entrepreneur help. And they get people in, the people aren't successful, and either they quit and they go back to their job, just sort of worse for the wear, or they just like persist and they keep beating their head against the same wall and maybe go buy a bunch of other products. So I do think this is so important for people to hear.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of these things, right? We know that, not to be like super technical, but the distribution of entrepreneurial outcomes is such that the average doesn't actually tell you anything, because all the gains from or not all the gains, but most of the gains are concentrated in a very few super winners, right? And lots of people who are just getting zero, right? The economics of this are a little bit like professional sports or music, right? There are some people who take home all the earnings and lots of people who don't, right? So average is not particularly informative.
Yeah, if you take the average between myself and Jeff Bezos, we both have an income of, or a $1 billion net worth. That means nothing for me, right? And that's exactly. That's your point. Yeah. Very true. Okay, so how can people take that?
There are more costs that I think are worth mentioning.
Go ahead.
Right?
Give us the bad news.
It gets
Give us
worse.
The bad news before you do good news.
Also, it seems to be the case that entrepreneurs take more antidepressants and psychoactive drugs, right? Not in the illicit sense, but in the
I understand clinical, like
yeah, because entrepreneurship is incredibly stressful, right? Mm-hmm. If you were prone to depression, anxiety, things like that, it gets worse. And if you weren't prone, there's a good chance that it can push you over the edge. Often the uncertainty and insecurity that comes with being an entrepreneur, if you're not particularly successful, and the anxiety that comes with it if you are, right? Because you have employees who you're responsible to, it actually takes quite a strong toll on people's private lives as well. So divorce rates are higher, for instance, and sort of and probably just like relational strain all around, right? And you can see how this can be sort of compounded when we're dealing with not just failed innovation-driven entrepreneurship, but this sort of entrepreneur thing, right? Because there's some sort of, right, you can imagine how your partner, who might be supportive of you trying something and being very sincere about it, might support you as you're trying to build something and just not succeeding. But if your partner is seeing through this, right, and seeing that this is just identity work, you can imagine how that strain gets stronger. And you can imagine how once you start reflecting, once you've had a straight streak of failure and you see yourself as an entrepreneur, the psychological trauma can be sort of quite a lot stronger. And actually some of the depressing but interesting commentary on the paper after it came out has been from people saying like, I was a Veblennian entrepreneur and it hurt me. Right. So some pretty heart-wrenching essays that I've been reading on that.
Guys, in the comments, please put, if you were a wantrepreneur, say, raise your hand, say, I was a wantrepreneur. We want to know. So go ahead.
So basically, those are sort of the big things, right? We'll be testing this out, of course, more empirically over the coming years. But the facts of the matter are that entrepreneurship is it's not a great profession, right? It is sort of like trying to become a rock star NBA player, right? It's very unlikely to succeed. Lots of downside risk.
Yeah, and most people ignore the downside risk because there's this incredible lionization of the entrepreneurship life, right? You've got just the constant bombardment of successful people, And you almost never hear from the people who don't succeed, because they are by definition sort of excluded out from the success magazine. And so you think to yourself, well, wow, look, it looks pretty great. Looks pretty awesome to be an entrepreneur. And I really appreciate you saying that. Also, people should go look up. I mean, a lot of entrepreneurs, even people that everyone thinks of as like the most inspirational, like people think like Elon Musk, the GOAT, you know, all that kind of stuff. He's the guy who's saying, hey, unless you like chewing glass, maybe don't be an entrepreneur. I mean, like, I think he said something like to that effect, like it's really, really, really tough. And he's right about that.
And even then, right? I mean, even if you look at really successful companies, it becomes quite obvious that the fact that they were successful, of course, it has something to do with them having some talent. And,
of course.
But they also got lucky, right? If you look into the story of Twitch, for instance, pretty obvious that, I mean, it was not like Twitch was meant to be a great success from day one.
Yeah, it started as Justin.tv, right?
Yes.
I'm
right,
interviewing. I'm interviewing the founder soon.
Oh, great! Fabulous.
Do you have anything to say?
No, I mean it's just like I mean they were obviously able to recognize an opportunity when it came.
Yeah.
But they recognized a lot of opportunities that weren't really good opportunities, and I think not like they did great, right? But they were lucky also to in some respects.
I think probably he will be the first to say that. I mean, enormously, because you had to sort of be the guy catching the wave of live streaming sort of, and there's no way he probably fully understood what that meant or could have foreseen some, Amazon buyout in his future. But yeah, I think so. That's a really great point, is that of course luck is involved, and hugely involved. Let's talk about
like one final thing.
I love this. I love the passion.
Okay, so one final thing, right, is that people think that young people are good entrepreneurs, actually, and that's blatantly not true. Actually,
that makes sense.
I just want to sort of insert that because now we're talking about Twitch, and you were mentioning some like Elon Musk, and these all were successful when they were young, right? And a lot of the cast of characters are the same, right? Mark Zuckerberg was very young, dropped out of school. Actually, there's really good evidence to suggest that the most successful founders are in their 40s.
You're right.
45 seems to be a good age to do it. And that makes a lot of sense, right?
It does.
Basically, because that's the point where you actually have some experience, right?
Yeah.
You actually know what it's like to work in a company. You might have managerial experience. Yeah. You might know an industry that you're entering. There's sort of this hype around young people being successful, and that sometimes you'll hear people saying, oh, you don't need industry experience to succeed in an industry. It's actually an asset to not know anything. But it's actually some good evidence also in this, that if you enter an industry with no experience as an entrepreneur, your chances of succeeding are very low.
Yeah, of course.
Right? Of course, right?
Of course.
And the way to think about it probably is that the people who become successful when they're really young would probably also have been successful when they were older, right? So the fact that they become successful at a young age is because they're just incredibly talented and lucky, right? They would have been successful at other points in time too. Most of us need some time to get going. Need to know what we're doing, right?
I think that's so unbelievably important to mention, is that first of all, it makes so much sense. I'm glad you're just giving us the data on, success in entrepreneurship, because I think there is a huge misunderstanding. And I've had this in my mind. I don't think I formally held it, but it's sort of mythologized in our culture to where a lot of people feel this way, even if they don't consciously hold this, that young people are entrepreneurs. That's what you do. Like if you want to be an entrepreneur, you start young, right? You get the failures out of the way. I've definitely probably internalized that. And there is an idea too that you don't need domain expertise. This is a big idea that you can just sort of be Elizabeth Holmes and you can just walk into blood technology and you can just innovate, because that's what Silicon Valley does. Explain to us why we need domain expertise. I mean, I get that it's a bit obvious, but maybe you should just explain.
Well, I mean, again, it depends on the industry, right? But I mean, very often being able to even understand the technology in a given field, right, will will be very important. Understanding the business models that underpin a given field is going to be very important very often. Being able to understand the right people to hire will often be very important, and be able to engage in the networks and in the industry culture will often be very important as well, right? I mean, you're trying to compete for the same customers, right? So having industry experience will often let you understand the customers that you're going to be dealing with, right? Or very often we find that people, right, they've worked in a given industry, construction, for instance, and then they develop an innovation that they're going to sell to construction companies, right? Because doing their work, they identify a problem and then they come up with a solution for it that they then sell to their old company, and companies like it, right? So industry experience is going to let you know what are actually the problems in an industry. And all of that is going to be generative, and it's going to help you not just get good ideas, it's also going to help you sort bad ideas from good ideas. Right?
So
finding out what are the low value things as things that are never going to fly.
So what you're telling people is it can help to get that industry experience first, because you're now making money instead of just like floating and probably losing money. You can do that. You can gain industry experience. You can identify a need. You can gain that domain expertise. You identify a need once you have that domain expertise, and then you launch a company later in your life when you're actually more likely to succeed due to you have experience.
Plus, at that point, you will maybe be in a different place financially,
yes,
which can also be very important. Like, one of the things that I find really depressing is that venture capital will often say that before you ask for venture capital, you should do a friends and family round, right? Which basically means you should ask your parents for money, or your friends, right?
It's a very nice way of saying, yeah. Ask
when you're young, you're going to be asking your parents for money, right? And sometimes parents will do that, right? But often, like, if you're not coming out of a very wealthy family, they will be giving you their life earnings, right, for your idea. And you can easily imagine how that really is going to strain relationships if you don't succeed, right? There's a real social downside to that. The fact is, if you wait until later, chances are that you will have friends who actually have money, right, and who understand the industry and can help you, not just with money, but also with other things. It also pains me when people like borrow against their house or something like that, right, to persist in a venture. It's very painful, right? As sort of a precautionary principle, if you know that entrepreneurship is really risky, right, you should think about it like buying lottery tickets. You should only bet with house money, so to speak. You should only pay with money that you can avoid to lose, that you don't mind losing.
Yeah.
And you should definitely set hard stops for yourself.
In the sense that you can keep digging. You can keep digging. You can keep
squeezing out more, right? But if you know that entrepreneurial success is really unlikely, you wouldn't do that. If you knew that success was rare, you would treat it, and if you knew that it was like essentially buying a lottery ticket, right, you would treat it differently than if you thought that success was just around the corner. And so that's one of the things that I would sort of push people for, right? Know that it's not very likely to succeed and treat it as such.
Let's talk about entrepreneurship advice. There's this huge entrepreneur industry, which is just like constantly bombarding people with entrepreneurship advice, the blueprint to success, as it were. That's the words I hear a lot. I'm sure that's not an academic term, the blueprint for success, but it does happen all the time. Now, one thing that drives me crazy to no end is that a lot of these things can be true, but sort of not helpful, or like sometimes true, but not always true.
Under very specific circumstances,
right? How do you see entrepreneurship advice helping and hurting people with regards to this sort of entrepreneur identity that people are cultivating?
Okay, so in a couple of different ways, right? I think it's worth just sort of underscoring that point, right? That a lot of the advice you get seems really sensible, sometimes counterintuitive, but sensible sometimes, right?
Let's give some of that advice.
Yeah, so for instance, you should really get comfortable with failure, right? That's like very generic, right? Something surrounding like the minimal viable product, for instance, right? This idea that you should just like try to get something together, put it in front of customers, accept that it's not very good, and try to learn from the experience.
Right.
Other advice, like just pitch, right? Just don't take no for an answer. Try your idea with many investors. If they don't give you money, keep going.
Yep.
Now, all those things, I think, can seem reasonable, right? And it seems to be the case that you can find successful companies that have done that, right? You can also find lots of successful companies that didn't do that. You can find successful companies that did do it, but that wasn't the reason that they succeeded. And you can find lots of unsuccessful companies that did it, right? That did something similar. So if you take something like the minimal viable product, right? There's a way in which telling people to just like try to get something together, put it in front of customers. If they don't like it, right? I mean, I think it's the Reid Hoffman of LinkedIn has this idea that if you're not ashamed of the first version of your product, you're doing it wrong. I think it's important to keep in mind that failure is never good. Sometimes you need to build up a certain tolerance for failure to take risk, right? Yep. But failure is never good.
We should say, just to be clear, it's not good in of itself. I mean, I think right. A lot of times it's lionized because the examples people are using are successes that are failures that led to future successes. But people can conflate that with like, oh, it means that when I'm failing, this is like a sign of my success. And
I'm doing something right.
Right.
So that's one thing. The other thing is like the pitch to investors, right? And keep pitching if they don't accept your idea, right? Well, you know, there's a way to think about getting rejected by investors, which is that maybe your idea is just bad, right? Maybe that is experience and good judgment telling you that this is not the way to go, right? And maybe persisting, right? There are companies that persist and succeed, but there are also lots of companies that persist and don't succeed. Right? I think that's sort of important to keep in mind that sometimes you need to take no for an answer because that is information that you're doing something wrong. And I think generally like the whole normalization of failure is actually part of why you can keep people in ventures that are not doing well, right? That saying that failure is part of the recipe and they just need to wait that success is around the corner. I think it's a really counterintuitive way for most people to think, and it's good that it's counterintuitive. You should be more sort of concise about what you mean when you say that failure is good.
Yeah, I think the tricky thing is that for some people that really is how they succeed, is they just keep failing and they sort of accumulate experience through failure. And I think that's the kind of meaning behind when people say this. But what you're saying is, yes, but there are a lot of people who take that advice, which might be good in a corner case or in a case of, you know, this person over here. For Reid Hoffman, it might be good with his minimum viable embarrassing product, but it could be really bad for a lot of other entrepreneurs. And you should be smart about taking that advice or sort of like holding it very loosely, that type of advice.
Yes, you should definitely think about how far am I willing to go? And I think you should commit to that before the fact. This is the amount of time that I will spend trying to get this to work. Because people are going to have different circumstances that allow them to take more or less risk. And it's easy to just sort of get pulled in. This is what economists sometimes call the sunk cost fallacy, right? Or if I spent a year on it, I might as well spend another month, right? And I think that's definitely worth considering. And I mean, some of the advice is much more technically we'd call it contingent than it's given credit for, right? It might work, but it might also just not work at all. And being smart about when that advice is going to apply is very difficult. And I think, and the basic problem is this, I think, people go to ask for advice because they don't know what to do, right? So they have a so if you knew how to gauge the value of the advice, you wouldn't be asking the advice very often. Right?
So by definition, when you get the advice, you are sort of
it's hard to know if it's good advice. It's very hard to know if it's good advice when you get it, because if you knew whether it was good advice, you wouldn't be seeking
good advice.
Right?
That's hilarious.
So I think it's very worthwhile to sort of trying to separate yourself, right? The basic thing that you should probably do, I think, is to say, how much time and how much money am I willing to invest in this?
Correct.
And commit to that, right? And say, it might be that success is just around the corner, but I don't know if I can wait that long, right? That's one thing. And then the other thing is to definitely do some work to separate oneself from the hype. To say, okay, I don't care if it worked for Facebook or LinkedIn or whatever. What are the chances that this might work for me? And then treat your idea as something that you're trying to prove out that it won't work so that you can get out, right? Prove out that this is too good of an opportunity to not abandon, right?
Right.
I think that's the way to think about it.
And don't be afraid to pick up some industry experience before you jump into your big idea. I know every idea seems like it's pressing and it has to be done right now. But I think you made a really compelling argument to maybe hold off a bit, get some real world experience before you go launch your entrepreneurship career.
And I mean, like, not every idea is worth dropping out of school for, right? And there's a big difference between dropping out of school because you think it's too easy, right? If you're Mark Zuckerberg and leaving Harvard because you think it's too easy, that's very different from dropping out of pretty much any other school because
Your
you think
state
it's
college
not quite
because-
relevant. Right?
Yeah,
That's
right,
very
right.
different. And that's a very different sort of information you're getting about your potential.
And to be very
offense.
clear, no, absolutely. And to be super clear, you can look at the outcomes of people with degrees, and especially like Ivy educated degrees, and you can look at the difference between that and people who have dropped out. On the list of billionaires, 30 millionaires and up, it is just overwhelmingly dominated by people who have sunk a bunch of time into their education, regardless of whether you think education's overpriced or not. Yes.
It probably is, but it's also underutilized, I think. If you sort of have the willingness and the drive to become an entrepreneur and to work as hard as some people are for that, I think there's a way to get much more out of college than most people do. But that's a separate discussion. But
sure,
I think
that's interesting. Underutilized, probably you mean in the sense of how you're using the resource, right?
How you're using the access to people who know something, how you're using the access to networks, how you're using the access to information. I mean,
because there's no shortage of people going to college and just kind of
benefiting as much as they could.
Yes.
Not paying as much attention as they could.
You know what? I think there needs to be a paper about the Veblanian college student, because there's certainly like an identity class of like, oh, I'm just, going to school. That's a separate discussion for a separate time. But,
but absolutely.
Yeah. So one of the things you shot an email about is alternative strategies for people. You talked about Joshua Gans. Have we talked about that yet at MIT?
We haven't. Joshua Gans is at Toronto and has done some interesting work with Scott Stern at MIT. And they basically have a whole series of papers about, you can actually get the book for free. It's online. If you search for entrepreneurial strategy, you will be taken to the website and you get the book for free. It's a really good book. Highly recommend it. One of the reasons that I mentioned that in our pre-discussion was that people sometimes have the impression that disruption is the way to be an entrepreneur, right? Disruption is one of these things, right? You should really go after challenging industries, upsetting the incumbents, things like that. I recommend that book because it's so helpful for thinking about different strategies and often less risky strategies to pursue with ideas, right? There are going to be cases where disruption is probably the right path for an entrepreneur to take, but there are often alternative strategies that are worth considering and testing out that will, like disruption is probably like the most risky thing you could do, right?
Right, you're trying to change.
You're trying to fundamentally change an industry, unseat incumbents and like established firms, like trying to take down Blockbuster, Ford, whichever, like name your industry incumbent, right? And very often that is going to be an incredibly risky strategy for all kinds of obvious reasons. Their work is interesting, I think, because it can probably help people think about the value of doing some things that are less risky, but nonetheless, that are going to be lucrative and interesting for many people, especially if you have industry experience. There are ways to think about any given idea in more or less risky ways.
Do you think there's the reason that we only think largely of, I guess, being an entrepreneur in terms of disruption because of the fact that all of the cases that a lot of people immediately think of when they think of like entrepreneur, they think of recent examples where you had this emergent technology that really changed everything and it made disruption very easily possible for, some industries. And so you had these like monsters come out like Facebook, Tesla, all these companies, which it's like,
yes.
So we always think of those because those are the most, the biggest examples, but maybe the most common example, the examples that actually are bearing out for a lot of people are not the disruptive cases. And that's maybe what you're saying.
Exactly. The thing, like lots of people or lots of entrepreneurial companies will be faced with the choice of whether to do something that is disruptive and high risk, or maybe something that is not quite as disruptive, more oriented towards what their book calls value chain strategies, where you're basically trying to help other companies do well and succeed, right? That often is something that works best if you actually have industry experience, as we talked about before, because you know the organizations in an industry and you can say, what are the pain points and how can I sort of try to solve those in an interesting way? So I'd highly recommend that for most people to sort of just broaden, like if you want to be an entrepreneur, if that is for you, right? And if you're comfortable with all the risk and all the downsides that we've talked about, right? I definitely encourage people to read that as sort of a way to broaden their imagination about how you can be an entrepreneur. Because there are many, many more ways to do it. And the Silicon Valley model is just one. And it's not going to be the right one for lots of people. It's definitely a very risky one.
I think that's so important. And one thing I want to remind the audience of is that neither myself nor Dr. Hartman are against entrepreneurs.
No, quite the contrary. Quite the contrary.
This is about getting people to have better outcomes by thinking more critically about being an entrepreneur and what that means, because what your paper kind of compellingly crafts a narrative for is that there's sort of there's an entrepreneur ideology that sort of a lot of people just sort of buy into, just like the disruptive idea that everyone just sort of thinks, oh, that's the way you start a company. And of course, it's just one of the many ways you could start a company. There are a lot of useful ways to thinking about entrepreneurship that if you're going into it, it is important to know. You have to not just think, only positive thoughts all the time. You have to know the risks. Part of being a successful entrepreneur is understanding and hedging against risk. It is so undervalued. Sorry, I don't just got a little.
That is an excellent summary. I think that's definitely very important, right? To really appreciate, is this for me, right? Like we talked about this, that there is being an entrepreneur has something of trying to be a professional athlete about it, right?
Right.
So that for most people should be a red flag saying, no, I'm not going to do that. Mm-hmm. If you are called to do it, right, then you should definitely know the ins and outs of it. And you should think about the different ways that you can approach this. You should know about the kind of things that are really risky and the kinds of things that will get you injured and the things that will push you out of the game, right?
Yeah.
And that will lead you to costs that you don't want to bear. I think that's really important. Because as you say, entrepreneurship is super important, but well-functioning entrepreneurship is even more important. Like the economy does not work without entrepreneurship. We tried economies without entrepreneurship. It was called the Soviet Union and it wasn't great, right? Yeah. So we need entrepreneurship a lot, but we also need it to work well, and we need people to not be misled about what it is and the kinds of risks that are involved, for sure.
And the realities of how to do better at entrepreneurship. I mean, I think the funny thing is you're presenting us with sort of like hard data on what so many other people are promising to make you a better entrepreneur. And you're telling us what entrepreneurship success looks like in the data. And I think that's so important for people who are, in the audience who are interested in that, to really take to heart. So I will link. We will talk about a lot of the papers and the sources you cited for statistics related to success, when you're young or when you're old. We'll talk about, education. We'll have the educational strategy book linked in the show notes. And also, of course, I will be linking the paper, which I found I have cited that paper a bunch of times sort of informally on the channel. And I knew I always wanted to do an interview about it because it holds a near and dear place to my heart. But let's be clear, this is a theory, right? Like this is part of academia, is that you are proposing a theory to fit data that is happening, which is like declining entrepreneur outcomes. Would you like to talk about that a little bit, like hedge a little of what we're talking about?
Right. So So I think people should read the paper, actually, because what we're doing is we're proposing a way that things might work, right? And there are different interpretations that one could make. What we're suggesting is essentially a hypothesis, right? Mm-hmm. Academic production is such that you often have what's called a conceptual paper, which lays out an idea, and then you have empirical studies that basically present data, right? And we're in the process of beginning those the data collection, but I'm producing different hypothesis papers, and this is one, right? The paper that you can find online now is not published yet, so it hasn't been through peer review. The peer-reviewed version will be out by summer. It has been accepted for a journal which is called Research in the Sociology of Organizations, but that will come out. And when you say when you talk about hard data, I should say this is not data that we have collected. This is data from other studies, just sort of to be clear.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the interpretation that we're offering is also not is not proven out by data, and it's not a widely accepted view, right? I mean, there's quite a lot of consensus that entrepreneurial quality is declining. It's not a unanimously held view, but it's pretty close. So that is sort of a real thing. The idea that the linking of the entrepreneurship ideology to the entrepreneurship industry to declining entrepreneurial quality is sort of that's our idea,
right?
That's our idea, and it's conjecture, I think. We'd say, right?
Yeah.
So just absolutely. To be clear.
No. I appreciate it. I appreciate how careful you are, and I think that's an important part of any kind of if you're going to be in academia, that's part of your job, right? Is to tell people like what's settled, what's not. And I appreciate you doing that. Dr. Hartman, thank you so much for coming on the show. I hope people got a lot of, to use a loaded expression, value out of that.
I hope so too.
So
I hope some more informed career choices will ensue, for sure.
Same here. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the opportunity. Have a great day.
We'll see you next time.
I know what you mean. This ain't what it seemed. Nothing but a trick, trying to sell me on a dream, but that was where you lost me. Wake up and smell the coffee.